Hi, I'm Dan Munoz, and this is Philosopher Citizen. Imagine you're on the highway, headed to the job you landed after college. You're aware, as you've been told, that you're fortunate to have what you have and should be thankful, for life has dealt you a favorable hand. However, in your rearview mirror, you spot the sleek outline of an unusual car, a Bugatti. And as the supercar passes, you notice that the driver is an old man. Now, would that elicit any negative emotions in you? Or would you feel a sense of hopefulness, perhaps imagining that if you kept your nose to the grindstone, you too could one day own such a fine machine? But what if instead of an old man, you saw that the driver remarkably looked just like you? How would you feel then? Would you become a bit self-conscious of your state in society? Or would you find comfort in comparing your car to one in a more wretched state? Since we all experience these thoughts from time to time, it may seem logical to think it's a part of human nature. But this may not be true, for our thoughts and the behaviors that come with them change with that of our culture, where progress in society also bring forth regressions in behavior. For example, in the past, the peasant knew he could never be a noble, thus he was spared the frustration stemming from believing it was within the realm of possibility. But today, not only do all believe anything is possible, it's also beneath us to want anything other than the throne itself. And so, we conjure up dreams that have very little chance of becoming reality. We tell friends and family our hopes for the future, and in their kind-hearted desire not to be monsters, they encourage us to pursue that which is not going to happen. And in so doing, they set us up for despair. This is not to say that I endorse serfdom. I'm not suggesting one would be happier under conditions of servitude. What I mean to say is that one should base their happiness not on the scale the majority uses to measure success, but a scale of one's own making, befitting one's own natural and unique attributes, as Rousseau said. Be a man. Restrain your heart within the limits of its condition. Study and know these limits, however narrow they may be, for a man is not unhappy as long as he closes himself up within them. He is unhappy only when he wants to go out beyond them. He is unhappy only when, in his senseless desires, he puts in the rank of possible what is not possible. He is unhappy when he forgets his human estate in order to forge for himself imaginary estates. And these imaginary estates run rampant in the West today, perhaps due to wealth being overrepresented in the media or through the manner in which we educate our children. Whatever the cause, one thing is certain, that is, the promised happiness one expects from the objects we desire in our imagined estates isn't simply from the utility one gets from their usefulness, for one gets the same utility from a Honda than as a Bugatti if you were only concerned with getting from point A to point B. This must mean that the happiness one wants, either secretly or not, stems not from the object's usefulness, but from others viewing you as special in some sense, simply because you own it. And this is a facet of what is called amour propre, which is the desire for special recognition by others. The tragedy being, when everyone's well-being is predicated on the recognition of others, recognition itself becomes a scarce commodity. And with this scarcity comes the inevitable denial of recognition to all but a lucky few. The unlucky, aka the majority, upon witnessing some make it while they themselves spin their wheels, find their desire for recognition inflamed, and thus invite misery and futility into their lives. For in order to feel equal with those whom achieve our dreams, we must then strive not for equal standing with our fellow man, but superiority, if only as a means of preventing us from feeling inferior to the lucky few who achieve extraordinary success. What's hilarious is that this desire to be seen and respected as superior can't be achieved, for in the West, no one is willing to admit that anyone is better than themselves, at least not without being paid to, which further inflames the passions and alters our disposition. No one escapes this, not even the very rich. And so, we are enslaved to each other's opinion, regardless of how high one climbs in life. Even if there's no one at your level to compare yourself to, one still not only desires, but seeks out that which only others can provide, namely, a good evaluation. As Rousseau said, the sociable man, always outside himself, is capable of living only in the opinion of others, and so to speak, derives the sentiment of his own existence solely from their judgment. This regrettable situation can be said to progress, or hopefully even regress, hand in hand with that of inequality. As inequalities push the rich further from the poor, the symptoms of toxic amour propre are made worse, yet all is not hopeless. There are still paths out of the darkness, and that's the purpose of this episode, to investigate how and why we came to such a state and determine what can be done about it through the lens of the radical Jean Jacques Rousseau. It's necessary to differentiate between the two types of inequalities, those of natural and the moral kind. Natural being the distribution of physical attributes bestowed upon a population by nature herself. Some are of stronger body, others of stronger mind. None are built the same. Moral or social inequality, on the other hand, are the privileges one enjoys by virtue of their wealth and status. While Rousseau conceded that social inequalities are legitimate only insofar as they are directly proportional to a person's natural endowments, he would have scoffed at the idea that this is indeed the state of affairs. Consider this. In 1965, the median CEO salary was 26 times that of his employees. Today, that number has climbed to between 300 to 500 times that of his worker. Now, can it truly be said that the productivity of the CEO has increased by such a degree as to justify the social inequalities that develop from that kind of difference in compensation? Let's say you can defend that position, proposing that the modern CEO is more intelligent and more potent than ever before. What then of the CEO's children, who will most likely inhabit the upper echelons of the wealth distribution regardless of their natural endowments? And what of the children's children? Is it possible that one could grow to become a fool, yet nevertheless find himself more powerful than the wise? I think so. As everyone can think up examples of rich imbeciles, it's easy to understand why Rousseau denied that there was an essential connection between the two inequalities, as he says, "It's useless to inquire whether there is any essential connection between the two inequalities, for this would be only asking, in other words, whether those who command are necessarily better than those who obey. If the strength of body or of mind, wisdom or virtue are always found in particular individuals in proportion to their power or wealth." A question fit perhaps to be discussed by slaves in the hearing of their masters, but highly unbecoming to reasonable and free men in search of the truth. If it were true that natural inequalities always dictated a man's position in life, then I suppose you could say social inequalities were always legitimate. Yet that's not the case, is it? One may ask if social inequality is indeed artificial, in the sense that it doesn't follow naturally from a man's inborn abilities, then how do the rich get richer and the rest stay the same? The answer is by our consent. By that I don't mean we explicitly vote for unfair distribution of wealth. Indeed, if given the chance, we would vote for more equal society. Instead, we consent by believing things are this way simply because of human nature, and nothing can be done about it. In believing that, we consent to the status quo. On the state of nature and the origins of inequality. It may be useful to discuss how Rousseau imagined social inequalities came to be. While it's true that it's not an accepted view of human evolution, he imagined that man was at first a solitary being, concerned only with his own survival. As he said, "I see him satisfying his hunger under an oak, and his thirst at the first brook. I see him laying himself down to sleep at the foot of the same tree that afforded him his meal, and there all his wants completely supplied. Happy is he who depends only on himself for sustenance." Man, in this condition, was thus naturally good. Good in the sense that evil can't get a foothold when one has the means of satisfying his needs independently. For why steal food if you know how to hunt? Additionally, man was endowed with characteristics that separated him from the beasts of the forest. Of principal importance was that of our freedom. Disregarding what has been said about notions of free will in modern times, to Rousseau and to myself, freedom of will is what separates us from the animals. And in his freedom to act as he so chooses, even against his animal instincts, man can slowly elicit a change in his nature. It is this capacity for change, or perfectibility as Rousseau calls it, that allows for the development of all the faculties which make us distinctly human, such as the capacity to reason. And when man began to reason, he learned of the ease in which one could survive with the cooperation of others. In so learning, he brought about the first conditions upon which man became dependent not on himself, but on the community. One might think this was a positive thing, Yet harshly, Rousseau claimed that this change from an independent and solitary existence to one of social dependence weakened our mind and bodies, as he said. Nature treats all animals left to her care with a predilection that seems to show how jealous she is of that right. The horse, the cat, the bull, and even the ass are generally of greater stature and always more robust and have more vigor, strength, and courage when they run wild in the forest than when bred in the stall. To Rousseau, the conditions in the state of nature made it to where only men and women of strong constitutions survived to reproduce. Of the children born to the savage woman, he says, nature treats them exactly as Sparta treated the children of her citizens. Those who come well formed into the world she renders strong and robust, and all the rest she destroys. Yet when in society, those whom never would have survived in the wild may come to adulthood and reproduce. Thus weakness of body and or mind were perpetuated. Furthermore, as society progressed, the instincts bred into us by nature slowly worked its way out. Generation after generation, man knew less of how to survive in a natural world and more of how to act in a social one. Surely we had more to eat, but we also gave up something in return. Like the statue of Glaucus, which time, the sea, and storms had so much disfigured it that it resembled a wild beast more than a god, the human soul, I say, altered in society by the perpetual succession of 1,000 causes, by the acquisition of numberless discoveries and errors, by the changes that happened to the constitution of the body, by the perpetual jarring of the passions, has in a manner so changed in appearance as to be scarcely distinguishable. This all came to a head with the advent of agriculture and the institution of private property rights. For as long as small bands of hunter-gatherers had to move to follow prey, inequalities were generally kept from growing too disproportionate, as everything you own must be carried on your back. But when man first reasoned that he could more easily survive by sowing seeds than by chasing herds, he made the fateful decision to stop moving, making it possible to develop a surplus and grow ever larger populations. Yet the surplus in itself is not the cause for concern. The problem arose when man cordoned off a plot of land and called it his own, as Rousseau passionately put it. The first man, who after enclosing a piece of ground, took it into his head to say, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. How many crimes, how many wars, how many murders, how many misfortunes and horrors would man have saved the human species, who pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditches should have cried to his fellows, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong equally to us all, and the earth itself to no one." With the advent of private property, it followed that through skill, luck, or a mixture of both, some men had more and others had less, and thus societies began to stratify. Where in simple societies there were few social goods to compete for, the values people placed on one another were related to their natural endowments. Beauty in body or merit in some relevant form is what garnered esteem among the community. As I've said before, those attributes that one knows there is little one can do to alter doesn't bring about the despair that comes with believing that one can and yet can't. But as the population grew in complexity and a division of labor emerged, goods of an increasingly refined nature became available. Man then made another fateful choice. He decided that he who controlled the most wealth would get the most advantages. And so private property, coupled with the division of labor, compelled those who weren't lucky enough to own fertile land to then enter the employ of the more advantaged in order to meet their needs. In so doing, a contradiction of wants followed. The advantaged, in order to gain ever higher esteem in society, needed those to work for him for the least amount of money, while the disadvantaged wanted the most amount in return for their labor in order to secure a better life. One may think that an impasse always occurs in these types of arrangements, and yet they don't. For as Adam Smith says in The Wealth of Nations, it is not, however, difficult to foresee which of the two parties must, upon all ordinary occasions, have the advantage in the dispute, and force the other into compliance with their terms. The masters, being fewer in numbers, can combine much more easily. In all such disputes, the masters can hold out much longer. A landlord, a farmer, a master manufacturer, or merchant, though they did not employ a single workman, could generally live a year or two upon the stocks which they have already acquired. However, many workmen could not subsist a week, few could subsist a month, and scarce any a year without employment. So once one group has the means of compelling another into submitting to their demands, domination occurs, and with that, freedom is lost. So what can be done? All this is interesting, but it wouldn't be useful if Rousseau didn't have an idea as to what to do about the predicament. Indeed, he does, for the answer lies in a complete shift in the way citizens think. One need not forsake his self-interest for that of another, nor relinquish his liberty to the leviathan of the state. Rousseau instead believed that the citizens should turn their back on representative government, that laws should not come from a few easily corruptible congressmen or senators. Instead, legitimate laws should flow only from the people themselves, free from the polluting effects of political parties. The rationale being that as long as one sees it as their duty to participate in the democratic process, not for representative, but for laws themselves, then one's freedom is more readily assured, since individuals in their self-interest know that voting for what was best for the community would more likely serve him better than what was best for some. In so doing, he obeys only himself and his interest, and is thus free. Again, this could only be accomplished with the abolition of political factions, who manage to get people to vote against their best interests by putting undue weight on some specific issue irrelevant to their constituents' economic well-being. Yet this is not to say that Rousseau thought only direct democracy was legitimate, for he knew it was impractical to have the entire population vote for every single rule that must be passed. As he said, "There has never been a real democracy, and there never will be. It is unimaginable that the people should remain continually assembled to devote their time to public affairs. Where there are people of gods, their government would be democratic. So perfect a government is not for men." Yet this is a contradiction, is it not? To say only the people should make laws, then say democracy is not for men? The way out of this contradiction is to understand that there is a difference between what is a legitimate law and what is a rule. A law can never be applied to a single individual. It must always apply equally to everyone. Therefore, they must be ratified by all. On the other hand, rules are what regulate individual behavior, and this is where the power of the executive comes in, authorized by the people to create and enforce rules born of the laws which support the general will. And so, according to Rousseau, it'd be rare that the sovereign people would need to assemble. That is, of course, if the state had an established constitution. Any changes to the constitution would require ratification by the population. In conclusion, I did say Jean Jacques was a radical. You may think that abolishing political parties or destroying Congress would never occur in the US, and you'd be right. Therefore, it may be useless to go down this line of reasoning. However, I argue that Rousseau is still relevant today, because if we make the effort to participate in not only general elections, but municipal ones as well, one could effect changes which over time compound and help steer the ship not towards the rocks, but to a harbor where all can prosper. For example, if all feel that even what children learn in schools was part of their responsibilities to weigh in on, then the general will would be transmitted through generations. Children, instead of being overly concerned with the history of peanut butter, entire classes could be devoted to helping children understand that what we should strive for isn't moral superiority, but moral equality. We could slowly reach a more equitable society as desired by instilling in the next generation the belief that no citizen should be so rich that he could buy another, and none so poor that he is compelled to sell himself. If we did value such a position, would we all play that silly game where we ask each other what depraved thing we would do for $1 million, not considering that there are those whom throwing away $1 million wouldn't lose them a second of sleep? I think not. I know Rousseau has been blamed for a great many things. He's been called a proto-Marxist by some because of his negative views on unlimited private property, even though he felt private property insofar as it related to a small working proprietor was sacred. He's been called a fascist, an anarchist, a totalitarian, and even a dog because of the things he supposedly inspired. Even Hitler himself he's been accused of inspiring. But I ask you, is it fair to judge one by the misguided acts others do in their name? If you blame Rousseau for the terrors of the French Revolution, shouldn't you likewise blame Einstein for the sins of the nuclear age? I would say that's absurd. And indeed it is. If you enjoyed this episode and wish to see more, giving it a like or a share goes a long way. This has been Philosopher Citizen. Until next time.